I asked when his wedding would be. I can still feel the phone against my ear, the cheap plastic case warm where my thumb rested. She laughed and said, "We already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." Those words landed like a plate slipping from a high shelf. It shattered somewhere inside me I didn't know was fragile, until there was nothing left to pick up but the edge of shame. The room smelled like the rest of my afternoon, coffee gone cold, lemon-scented cleaner that never quite reaches the corners. I was alone. The dress was still in the closet. It wasn't the dress that hurt most. It was the picture I'd painted in my head for years. Me on the other side of a camera, smiling at my son's new life, maybe sitting in the front row, a mother who had helped and been seen. Instead, there was a photograph on some private feed, laughing faces, my son leaning into his wife, but my face was absent. Someone else's hand held the bouquet I'd bought on a whim. The sofa in the picture, the same sofa I had helped pay for, the one with the indents from late-night television and my threadbare Afghan, looked too new to belong to the home where I used to be welcomed. When Lena said special people, it wasn't an offhand joke. It was a line drawn through me. I remember sitting down at my kitchen table and letting my hands rest, palms down on the wood, the throat tightening with that immediate animal shame. How could I have missed this? How had my kindness become invisible? The answer, as it always does with habits, was that I hadn't seen what I didn't want to see. For 3 years I had been the economy under their roof, the warm, steady current that kept their bills from catching fire. I told myself I was helping my son, doing what mothers do. He needed a hand with rent the first month after he moved out on his own. I gave it. Then another month. Little things here and there, groceries, a new winter coat, the repair on his old car after the radiator went, the first piece of furniture that made the apartment feel like a home. I was proud, even a little flattered that he turned to me. That's what family does, right? Only it wasn't small. The small things added up were heavy. I pulled out the little accordion folder where I kept bank slips and notes. For years I had put everything in there. The yellowed receipt from a Christmas sweater, the confirmation number from a wire transfer, a post-it that said, "Do not forget the rent." I spread the papers across the table like a deck of cards and began to sort. The numbers lined up like a tally of favors I had been taught to believe were love. Rent, $500 a month, 3 years. That's $18,000, I wrote in the margin. Utilities and phone help, about $75 most months, $2,700. A couch, a bed, a small bookcase when they moved in, $3,200. Cash gifts for unexpected bills, the kind you hand over in a kitchen at midnight, $5,000.
A wedding dress I bought because I wanted to be able to stand beside my son in a photograph, $800. Small loans I thought were temporary, $1,200. And the miscellany, the car repair, the replacement of the microwave they couldn't afford, groceries slipped into paper bags at the store, $2,500. I had to use the calculator twice, to be sure. The little machine clicked under my thumb and the sum blinked back at me like a verdict, $33,400. $33,400. 3 years of my life in numbers. Written down, it stopped being abstract generosity and became something else, a ledger of what I'd been expected to supply. Seeing it all in one place made me angry, not like the quick flare of humiliation you hide behind a smile, but the hot, resolute kind of anger that straightens your back and clears your throat. I traced the ink with my finger, as if touching the figures would make them mean less or mean different. They didn't. What they did, unexpectedly, was free me. The clarity let me stop apologizing to myself for being tired. It told me I deserved to stop. The decision happened in a very ordinary way. I called the bank. Banks are not dramatic places, at least not in my experience. Mine smelled like paper and hand soap, and the manager had the kind of hands that always looked busy. Mr. Klein had been watching the neighborhood longer than most of us had been living in it. He knew my name before I told it to him. There was comfort in that small bureaucratic recognition. He saw a customer, a client with paper and a signature. When I told him I needed to cancel automatic transfers, he didn't ask why. He asked how he could help. He could see the way my voice shifted from wobble to conviction halfway through the sentence. He sat me down in his small office and closed the blinds. Between his folders and a potted plant that tried to be cheerful, I explained. I slid the stack of bank statements across the desk. He did not lecture me. He did not call me naive or tell me I had been foolish. He looked at the numbers, then at me, and said quietly, "You did what you thought was right." He helped me fill in forms to stop the automatic monthly payments. He suggested gently that I open a new account in my name alone and move my money there. He offered to track any future incoming wires and to put a fraud alert on my vault of automatic transactions. That part of the afternoon is a blur now, the stamp hitting the paper, the swivel chair, the polite click of the keyboard. But I remember one particular thing, a small, embarrassed apology from him and the bank's part, for not asking sooner, for not signaling the pattern when transfers were going out. He promised to look into the account activity and to make a note, not in case we needed a story, but in case someone else walked in his door 5 years from now and needed to be spared the same blindness.
Leaving the bank with new folders, new account numbers, and the kind of documentation that turns suspicion into proof, I felt like a person who had remembered how to breathe properly. There's a lightness that comes after you stop pouring from an empty cup. There's also a sudden loudness, a ringing you are unprepared for because you finally allowed yourself to hear it. The calls I had ignored in the middle of the night, the messages that I had assumed were normal. Within hours of halting the transfers, things changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was a shift in the climate of my life, like the wind moving over water. I would answer the phone and hear a new urgency in my son's voice, the kind of voice that sounds worried when someone is asking you to drop everything. A few nights later, a knock at the door at dusk, a polite knock but persistent. When I opened the door, there were 2 women I recognized from our block, and a man I had seen in the cafe beside the market. My stomach did something it hadn't done since I was younger. It jumped and then sank. They offered small talk, then made excuses about being in the neighborhood. The woman who lived across the hall, Eleanor Brooks, Eleanor to some of the kids, gave me an odd look, the kind that asked questions without words. I told them I had been in the bank and that I would be okay. They stayed for tea. It was the phone call that came the next morning that really escalated things. Max called. He sounded controlled, but there was a hardness under his voice I hadn't heard since the day he left for college. "Mom," he said, "we're worried about you." Worried. That word had the power it can disarm. It has a moral lever built into it. The way I'm concerned can make you sit down, explain yourself, open the drawers you would rather leave closed. Worried about what? I asked. "We're worried about your memory," he said. "Lena and I have been talking. It's probably nothing, but could you see someone, just to make sure?" "Like a doctor?" I asked. "Yes, someone to do a check, for your safety," he said. There is always an invisible we in those sentences, the we that has the power to make decisions in your name and to claim that it does so out of love. Hearing it made a small hollow place in my chest. I had seen that kind of care before, thick with obligation, then on respect. It's the kind that gathers your papers under the pretense of organizing them and brings them back later with a note that the things you wanted to keep have been lost. It's the kind that quotes statistics about old people and driving and frailty and calls it a kindness to take the wheel. I agreed, because I knew that sometimes the simplest way to diffuse an accusation is to answer it with what it asks for. "Fine," I told him, "I'll see a doctor." But I had already been doing my own checks. After the $33,400 line stared up at me from my table, I had started a new folder, one titled simply Records.
It had copies of bank statements, printed emails, photographs of receipts, the carelessly folded note from the day Max called about the radiator, every text that mentioned, "Can you help?" I wrote short summaries for each transfer, who said what, when, why. I made a chronology that began with the first $500 I handed over and ended with the last debit to my account. If you had told me 3 months earlier that I would be assembling evidence like a private investigator, I would have laughed. But humiliation breeds attention. It pinches a part of you awake you might have left asleep otherwise. I became methodical, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I learned how to make a paper trail look like a story. I told myself, too, that if they were genuinely worried, then my records would allow me to be transparent. If there were questions about my capacity, I would be able to show that my mind was clear and that my decisions were my own. And if their worry was a pretext to assert control, then the paper would show motive. Then, as if to test the idea that I had simply started asking the right questions at the wrong time, my son's side of the family arrived at my door. They were not the sort of visitors you could send away gently. Max had come with someone else, a man I recognized from a few neighborhood disputes, Mr. Fisher, a young-looking attorney with a briefcase that was heavier than his smile. He introduced himself in the doorway with a practiced voice that felt like a stage whisper about business. "We just wanted to make sure everything's all right," Lena told me, and put on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I watched the way her hand touched the arm of the man beside her, like a small anchor. Behind her, Max stood like a messenger, his face the same soft one I had watched fall asleep on my couch when he was small. I looked at him and remembered him as a boy who learned to tie his shoes because I taught him, who skinned his knees and wanted Band-Aids that matched his dinosaur pajamas. It's a strange cruelty to be confronted with your history as an accusation. They had some forms in the briefcase, papers that talked about wellness checks and capacity assessments. Mr. Fisher's tone was careful, the kind that suggested he had done this before and that it was all very responsible. "You don't need to sign anything now," he said, as if that were a gracious choice. "It's just preliminary." There are these moments where you can see the future as a single frame. When a person offers you a form and tells you it's only preliminary, it has the same feel as someone telling you not to worry. The small phrase is the hinge on which larger doors swing. I felt my hands go to the form as if they had a mind separate from mine. For a second, I thought I would fold like a sheet of paper and hand them my name and my power. Then my new folder, the one Mr. Klein had helped me begin, rested on the kitchen table where I had left it that morning.
I felt the weight of it like a hand on my shoulder. It was the objectification of my choice. Simply papers, yes, but papers that said I had been paying their way. It was a ledger and a map and a defense. I remembered, too, something Mr. Klein had said in his office. If anyone asks, keep copies, show them who you are. So I did the most practical thing I knew to do in the face of polite invasion. I called my lawyer. Mr. Weather was an older man with a voice like gravel and a habit of listening to the end of a sentence before answering. He had come recommended by Eleanor, and he had, in the past, sounded exactly the sort of calm I needed. When I explained, slowly and with care, what had happened and what I had been keeping in my folder, he told me to keep doing what I was doing. He didn't tell me to barricade the house or brandish the folder at my family. He suggested that I document the visit and keep notes about who came and what was said. He said something else, more practical and less dramatic. Collect the records you have and make copies. If they suggest an evaluation, do one under your terms. Bring a friend. Bring someone who knows you. I hesitated at that last piece. Bring someone who knows you. There is a peculiar intimacy in asking for allies. Pride flickers. So does gratitude. I called Eleanor and a few of the women from my bridge club. Cynthia and Diana arrived with pies, and David from the corner pharmacy, who had watched me check the change and always had a kind word. The support was ordinary and deep. Friends who offered iced tea and looked at the stack of papers like it was a thing they could help hold. What happened next was swift and a little surreal. That afternoon, a social worker came by. She introduced herself with a kindly, professional smile. She asked questions that sounded official, almost rehearsed. Does anyone help you with bills? Who checks on you? Have you had any recent hospitalizations? I answered plainly. I told her I had been to the bank and had brought records. She took notes. She seemed at first roomy with empathy. Then, midway through her questions, the tone shifted. She started using phrases that felt like sandpaper. For us to ensure your safety. A routine check. We need to make sure decisions are made in your best interest. At the door, I could hear the hum of the street. I had never thought of my front step as a place where strangers would evaluate me, where my decision-making could be put under a microscope like some delicate clock. The social worker asked if I would be willing to have a clinical evaluation. I told her I would, as long as it was done openly and I could bring someone. She wrote something down, looked at her watch, and left me with a card. I sat down and closed my eyes. In the quiet of the afternoon, I allowed my feelings to course through me. The sting of exclusion, the hardening resolve, the strange flickering gratitude that my records existed. I would not be easy prey.
I would not sign anything from the doorway. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I prefer a clear kettle to a raised voice. But there are moments when a decision is less about loudness and more about line drawing. If you are raised to give, the boundary is scandalous at first. It feels like turning into the person you never wanted to be, cold, calculating, heartless. Yet the moment I ceased automatic transfers, I felt something else, an internal recentering that allowed me to look at those who loved me and to ask with a steady voice what they meant when they said it. There was no triumphant scene, no cinematic falling out with dramatic music. Instead, there were small bureaucratic movements, telephone calls, the clink of a lawyer's briefcase being opened in the living room, the patchy light of dusk over my kitchen table where my records lay. It felt oddly like stepping into a room you had once left messy and deciding to clean it, only to be accused of being ungracious for wanting order. When Max and Lena and Mr. Fisher sat in my living room and leafed through things, it felt like a rehearsal of roles I had not been told I would have to play. Max's questions, at first soft, became sharper. "Why did you stop sending the money?" he asked, not unkindly, but like a fact to be explained. I told him the truth. I told I had seen the photos, that I had counted the transfers, that the number made me see what I had been doing. I said it simply, without flourish. I did what I thought was right, and then I stopped. I'm asking for respect for that decision. Lena's expression hardened in a way that felt familiar. When people have been relying on something steady, they sometimes decide they are entitled to it. She reached into her bag as if to fetch a note, then paused. Mr. Fisher leaned forward and offered a calm. "Maybe we should look into a full evaluation. It could put everyone at ease." I remember the way silence sat then, like a third chair at our small table. It is a strange sound, the pause in which a life shifts. I thought of the $33,400 again, of the couch and the dress, and the months in which I slept with worry and gave away the shape of my own future for the temporary warmth of someone else's. Outside, the world kept moving. The mail truck rattled down the street. A teenager whistled on his bike. Inside, my hands rested on the folder as if on a Bible. I felt neither vindictive nor naive. I felt precise. That night I made a list, not of grievances, but of facts. Dates, amounts, conversations, witnesses, names of neighbors who had seen the sofa being delivered, the receipts that showed the payments, the messages that asked for help and promised repayment, men and women who had been there, who would be willing to say, "Yes, she paid for that." I slept badly. I dreamed of endless staircases with photographs pinned to the walls and no frames.
In the morning, I woke with a plan that felt less like a plan and more like the settling of a spine into a chair that had been missing its support. I called Dr. Moore's office, the psychiatrist that my neighbor had recommended, and asked for an appointment. Not because I feared they could find me wanting, but because I wanted professional confirmation for my own peace of mind. If I was going to be accused of losing myself, I wanted there to be an honest third-party voice to say I was whole. The appointment felt strange at first, like showing your report card to someone who is not a teacher. Dr. Moore was frank. He asked me about memory, about the little things, the names of grandchildren, a list of appointments, a tally of events. I told him the names of places I had worked at, the recipe my mother used for apple cake, the color of the curtains in the living room my parents had chosen 50 years ago. He asked me in the middle of a conversation about details and dates why I wanted the evaluation. Because, I said, I was excluded from a celebration my son had with people I supported. I want a paper that says I know who I am. He nodded. "We'll do the standard tests," he said, as if it were an everyday thing, and then added quietly, "But there's also a component of motivation here, why the assessment is being requested. We'll note who asked for it." That phrasing, "who asked for it," felt like a lever. It meant motives were recorded. It meant decisions were not hollow and anonymous. It meant that when someone later claimed the mantle of concern, there would be a paper trail that showed whether it was truly concern or something else. The tests were long in the way that a good exam should be, thorough, precise, and not intended to humiliate. Dr. Moore was calm while he administered tasks, the kind that ask you to remember lists or to draw a clock. He was kind but not indulgent, and when it came to the results, he was measured. "You are within normal limits for your age," he told me plainly. "There are always degrees of variance, of course, but there is no evidence that you lack capacity to manage your affairs." "Is that definitive?" I asked. "No," he said, "but it is an important piece of evidence." That was all I needed, for now, a small objective voice that balanced their worry with fact. In the days that followed, I found allies in odd places. Mr. Green from the pharmacy, who had a vivid memory of the day I left a $200 check to help with a medication copay. Mr. Davis from down the street, who had seen furniture being loaded into a truck. Names that at first felt like footnotes turned into a chorus. Their testimony would not be heroic. It would be ordinary, like watering a plant consistently until it grew. And yet the ordinary can be powerful. When your life is suddenly in dispute, it is the steady things, neighbors, receipts, stamped envelopes, that remind the world you exist. I started to see the work of defending myself as not a battle, but as the simple act of setting the record straight. That is where everything pauses, not because there is nowhere else to go, but because the moment before a door opens is its own landscape. You can see your reflection in the glass and decide how you will step through it. I had stopped the money. I had begun to document. I had allies and a doctor's note. I felt less like a victim and more like a person who had been boxed in and was now measuring the lines of the box. The knock on my door the afternoon after my appointment
was harder than the polite ones before. This time, the hand that knocked did it in a way that carried purpose. I opened the door and saw Max there, and Lena, and Mr. Fisher. There was a quiet crowd behind them, 2 neighbors who had been asked to come, a young woman from some agency who introduced herself with a card, and a tall man in a suit I'd not yet met who lifted his chain as if to say he had papers. "Yes," I said. "We need to talk about next steps," Mr. Fisher began, and the briefcase in his hand seemed to have multiplied weight. "There are forms that can make all of this easier for everyone." I looked at the people at my threshold, and then at the folder on my kitchen table that listed $33,400 in help. I thought of the dress still hanging where I left it, the sofa whose cushions had learned the shape of my knees. I thought about the way someone's special people could be decided without your consent. They had their papers, I had mine. The room hummed with the sound of decisions waiting to be made. I closed the door gently, not to shut them out entirely, but to bring the conversation into the room where my documents lay. I wanted that small, ordinary witness to be present for whatever came next. I put the folder on the table like a shield and sat down. They sat too. The air felt thick, like a room that had been painted and not yet dry. I could see the moment where everything might snap one way or another. I could see, too, how the rest of this would unfold. Questions about competence, forms to sign, assessments to be requested. I could imagine courtrooms and depositions, the slow grind of a system that measures people in words and witness statements. But in the quiet, I allowed myself the little, fierce clarity that had started this whole thing. I was not going to surrender the edges of my life for a polite phrase like, "We only invited special people." They opened the briefcase, and Mr. Fisher pulled out forms. He said something about facilitating a review, about putting an arrangement in place. Lena reached for one of the forms and unrolled it like a map. I had papers of my own. I had friends who would stand up and say what they had seen. I had a doctor who had looked me in the eye and said I was within the range of competence.
And more than that, I had spent the last hours counting and naming and giving a value to a kindness that had been mistaken for ownership. The room held its breath. I rested my hands on the table and felt the paper under my palms. The next words were being chosen by everyone in that small space, and I could already hear how they would echo. The room held its breath. I rested my hands on the table and felt the paper under my palms, like a map I'd been given at the edge of a strange country. They watched me the way a crowd watches a clock when it ticks towards something important. Mr. Fisher pushed his glasses up, as if adjusting them would sharpen the facts. Lena's jaw was tight. Max's eyes looked wet and distant, in that way that made me see, for a second, the little boy with the scraped knee and the makeshift bandage I'd wrapped around it. "We're only trying to be careful," Lena said. "It would be easier for everyone if there were a plan." "No plan without consent," I said. It surprised me how steady my voice sounded. Perhaps it was the records, the folder, the thought of $33,400 arranged in black ink on white paper. Perhaps it was that small, stubborn thing that holds a person upright when the room tries to tilt them. They left without signs of a cliff, just the slow closing of the front door and the soft clack of a briefcase. The air inside the house felt cleaner in some ways, as if the exit of dramatic people left room for ordinary things. The ticking clock, the chipped saucer on the counter, the dress in the closet that still smelled faintly of the boutique. The next morning, a legal notice arrived. It wasn't dramatic, just a stamped envelope and a formal sheet of paper, but its presence was enough to make the heart scuttle. They had filed for a wellness review and requested an assessment of my capacity. It was phrased in the benevolent language of concern and protection, the kind of language that can make a person doubt their own motives when they read it aloud. I called Mr. Weber. He did not gasp or scold. He advised. "We'll respond," he said, voice gravelly and calm. "We'll put everything in order, and we'll ask the court for a hearing. Bring me the folder." That day I went through the stack again, but now with different eyes. It was no longer a ledger of kindness that had become weight. It was evidence. I made copies. Every bank statement, every receipt, every text message. I annotated conversations. I wrote a chronology that began with the first $500 I had given 3 years earlier and ended with the last automatic transfer, now halted. I made a file of photographs, the sofa being delivered, the bed, the receipt from the boutique for a pink satin dress that had cost $800. I had photographs of bank slips, screenshots of posts on a private social feed that showed the wedding imagery and the taglines, "Just us, closest family only."
the kind of captions that quietly excluded some and elevated others.
For all the bitterness of the exclusion, I wanted nothing more than clarity. I wanted the truth of what had happened documented, examined, and understood. That was the architecture of my plan, to refuse to be swept away by sentiment, and instead to build a small fortress of paperwork and witnesses. Neighbors were easy to call. Eleanor came by with a thermos of tea and a look that said she had never expected to be in a courtroom, but she would be there if asked. Cynthia, Diana, Maria, Carmen, friends who had watched my life from beside me, offered to come, to sign declarations, to tell the simple truth of what they had seen. Mr. Klein at the bank made himself available for a statement about the transfers and suggested the bank could produce transaction histories. Dr. Moore agreed to write a formal report expanding on the evaluation he had already done. Mr. Green from the pharmacy said he remembered the day I paid that $200 copay and would be willing to speak to it. Even Mr. Davis, the neighbor who had been prickly and distant, agreed to appear to corroborate that he had watched the movers carry furniture one afternoon. Preparing for the hearing felt almost like preparing for a small private war. I would sooner have avoided conflict, but the notion that someone could quietly take authority over me under the guise of worry inflamed an old sense in me. Protect what is yours. Name what is true. That is not the language of vengeance. It is the language of a person learning to keep her own life. The court date was 2 months later. Those weeks passed in a strange rhythm. Routine days flattened against the slow beat of anticipation. In between calls to Mr. Weber, I took small pleasures. A walk to the park in the late afternoon when the world was brushed gold. A visit from friends who brought jellied salads and laughter. A stop at the craft store where I bought paint and brushes, because the idea of a blank canvas felt like a promise. The morning of the hearing, I dressed simply, in a navy cardigan and the sensible skirt I reserved for occasions that required dignity more than comfort. When Mr. Weber offered to send a car, I declined. I wanted the small, ordinary independence of walking to the bus stop and catching the number that would take me downtown. I sat on the bench outside the courthouse and watched people file in, their faces a small parade of stories. I felt oddly ordinary in a room that was about to divide what had seemed private into legal terms. Courtrooms have an implacable architecture. The walls are neutral, the light neutral, the bench is hard. There is something leveling about a place where everyone waits for the judge to speak. Judge Miller came in briskly, carrying a weight of experience in his posture. He did not look like a man who relished melodrama. He looked practical and steady. He listened to the opening statements with the kind of polite focus that names and numbers arrived as facts, not as a narrative. Mr. Fisher spoke first, polite and rehearsed. He spoke of concern and safety, and of the responsibility families sometimes shoulder when memory fails. He framed his client's actions as preventive and benevolent. I listened to the words because they were part of the process, but inside I kept returning to the $33,400, each dollar a breadcrumb that led me back to the moment Lena had said, "We only invited special people." Mr. Weber's opening was quiet but precise. He laid out the timeline, the transfers, the receipts, the social media images, the evaluation from Dr. Moore. "Within normal limits for her age," he said, quoting the doctor. He asked the court to consider the motive behind the actions, as well as the effect, the pattern of dependence created by consistent transfers, the sudden move to medicalize and to assume control when those transfers stopped. He did not scream. He did not demand vindication with dramatic flourishes. He simply lined up facts and witnesses and put them on the table, as I had done in my kitchen. The witnesses were the small chorus that had been my life. Mr. Klein from the bank testified to the automatic transfers and to the bank's concern when they were first alerted by my request to stop them. He spoke carefully, explaining procedures and hesitating when asked to interpret actions as wrongdoing. Mr. Green, the pharmacist, read from his written note about the day he accepted the $200 check. He said he had been handed the check by Lena, who had been present, and that it had been a matter of business between neighbors. Mr. Davis came forward with reluctance and admitted he had seen furniture being moved into Max's apartment on a certain date. He was not hostile. He was, in his way, embarrassed for having assumed things were typical. Then there was Dr. Moore, small, precise, clinical. He read his evaluation in language that was neither flattering nor damning. "No evidence of deficits sufficient to impair capacity," he said. That phrase, bland as it sounded, felt like an escape hatch wide enough for my dignity to slip through. The point was not to boast,
The point was to show that the claim of incompetence was not supported by the measured, documented test. When Mr. Weber called me to the stand, my hands were not shaking the way I had feared they might. Perhaps that was the work of months of preparing. I spoke plainly, and I told the truth the only way I knew how, in details. I described the call in which Lena had told me she had been married the day before, and that only special people had been invited. I described the photograph I saw in a private feed, the couch that looked too new, the bouquet I had bought and that someone else had held. I told them I had counted the money because someone needed to know how much I had given.
I laid out the numbers as fact. $500 a month in rent for 3 years, $18,000. $75 a month for utilities and phone, $2,700. Furniture and home items, $3,200. Cash gifts and late-night help, $5,000. The $800 dress, $1,200 in small loans, $2,500 in repairs and miscellaneous. I watched the faces in the courtroom as I said each number. For some of them, the arithmetic seemed like a revelation. For me, it was a ledger come to light. Cross-examination is an excavation. Mr. Fisher asked questions that felt rehearsed. He tried to plant seeds of confusion, of forgetfulness. "Isn't it true you sometimes forget appointments?" he asked, aiming to carve out a wedge where memory might be used as a tool. I answered with care. I acknowledged I misplaced things sometimes. Who doesn't? And I explained how I had remembered things that mattered. Memory is not a single line, I told the court. It bends. It surprises. It can be tested. That is why I welcomed Dr. Moore's examination. Lena's testimony was the oddest to watch. She seemed at once confident and brittle. Mr. Weber's questions circled around inconsistencies, dates of certain requests, whether she had known about the cost of certain items, who had been asked to sign which checks. She shifted on the stand like a person pulled by an internal current of guilt and necessity. At one point, she denied that the wedding photos had been private. 2 clicks of a laptop and a printed image from the social feed were on the table. No tags, but intimate angles, congratulations from friends of theirs. The judge looked at the photograph and then at Lena. She faltered when asked whether she had paid for the boutique charges. Mr. Weber gently showed a receipt. Her answers grew small. There was a moment I will not forget. A question from Mr. Weber to Max about a text he had sent to me the night before the wedding. The text read something like, "We're keeping it small. Hope you understand." Max stammered at first and then said, "I didn't think it would hurt you." His voice folded in the courtroom. I could see the boy in him, trying to understand what he had done. But apology in a legal room is an odd thing. The court did not exist to make people feel better. It existed to decide. Mr. Fisher tried to call witnesses to the effect that there had been concern about my judgment in handling money. He called a social worker who had done the initial wellness check. Her testimony was careful. She said she had noticed nothing alarming, but that the pattern of transfers raised questions for some family members. Mr. Weber asked questions gently that revealed the social worker had not concluded the need for guardianship herself. She had only suggested further assessment be done as a conservative measure. Mr. Davis, who had been slightly hostile in the first interviews, was then led by Mr. Weber into admitting that he had assumed things without asking.
He admitted the furniture deliveries had been visible from his window, but that he had not known who had paid for them. The effect was small but cumulative. The defense's argument that my capacity was in question began to look in the careful architecture of testimony like a paper umbrella in a hurricane, fragile and not likely to alter the course. The tense moment came with the question of motive. Mr. Weber did not accuse. Lawyers do their work by inference as much as accusation. He lined up the timing and the pattern, consistent transfers over months and years, the halting of transfers, and then suddenly the request for an evaluation. He did not say they wanted access. He asked the court to notice how the sequence favored those who had relied on a steady flow of money. It was not rhetoric. It was arithmetic and timing and human motive. The judge listened. When the court took a recess, I was surprised at how tired I felt, not from stress, but from the kind of exhaustion that follows a long conversation. Mr. Weber sat beside me and patted my hand. The gesture felt like the kind of ordinary human comfort that had carried me through nights without it. "You did well," he said simply. "You were clear." The afternoon held the cross-examination of the defense's witnesses and the presentation of further documents. Mr. Klein, the bank manager, explained the new account we had opened and described the halted transfers. He did not assign blame. Banks do not do moral judgments. He supplied records, and those records had the thing that matters in court, dates and signatures. At one point, Mr. Fisher attempted to make the argument that I had been peculiarly adamant about recovery of documents, and that, he chose his words with care, this could be evidence of something. Mr. Weber countered gently that the recovery of one's papers is reasonable and necessary when those papers prove choices and competence. The judge asked delicate questions about how evidence had been collected and whether any of it had been coerced.
It was on those points that the care and the calm of my earlier months shone. Everything had copies. Everything had been produced transparently. Finally, the judge requested closing statements. Mr. Fisher's closing was soft and paternalistic. He spoke of love and concern and the desire for safety. Mr. Weber's closing was composed and deliberate. He read a passage of the chain of transfers and then said plainly, "This is not just about money. It is about autonomy, the simple right to manage one's affairs without having them classified as incapacity when someone else benefits from them. We ask the court to deny guardianship and to allow Mrs. Richter to remain in control of her own finances." Judge Miller did not give a speech. He asked a few more clarifying questions and then recessed to consider. The wait felt like the time between a tide change, the ocean pulling away and then returning.
In that time, I sat in the visitors area and watched my friends' faces. They were not theatrical. They were practical and ordinary. Eleanor squeezed my hand. Cynthia refilled my water glass. Somewhere, someone offered a tin of peppermint candies, and the small comforts of companionship kept me steady. When the judge returned, the room felt heavier somehow, as if air had thickened with expectation. He read the state's conclusions calmly, and then said, "After careful review of the evidence presented, including the professional evaluation of Dr. Moore and the financial documentation, the court finds no sufficient evidence to support the appointment of a guardian at this time." Those words were precise and clinical, yet they landed inside me like a hand unclenching. The courtroom exhaled. For a moment, none of us moved. I felt the shape of my life settle back into place. Mr. Weber's eyes were wet. He had not been theatrical, but there was a lightness in his features that matched my small, stubborn joy. Judge Miller added a line about the importance of family and counsel to work together, but emphasized that the court's primary duty was to protect liberty and not to remove it unless there were clear cause. On the walk home, the city looked slightly altered, as if the day had been marked by something that mattered, and the light shone different because of it. I passed the little bakery where I had always bought scones, and felt like rewarding myself with something sugary and ridiculous. I stopped to buy a lemon tart, and paid for it with the pocket of my new purse, my purse, not borrowed or entrusted. The cashier smiled and said, "Congratulations." I wanted to tell her about the $33,400, about the courtroom, about the dress and the closet. Instead, I ate my tart on a bench and let the sweetness sink in. Max called that evening. His voice was clipped. He did not ask to come over. He said, "I'm sorry if you felt excluded." I kept my reply short. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk. It was that the relationship had shifted in a way I could not fix with words alone. "I will be fine," I said. "Please take care." He did not press me for further reconciliation. That I had expected. What I had not expected was how clean the line felt when it was drawn. I had not wanted to break family bonds. I had wanted my own space recognized. The judge had endorsed that, in the measured way courts can. There was no dramatic falling away in life. A few things changed immediately. The automatic accounts remained closed. The bank put a watch on any future transactions. Mr. Klein called occasionally to check in. Lena and Max did not come to visit for a long while, though they did not completely disappear from my life. They were in the slow way families are, present at a distance. In the months that followed, I did practical things as if to cement my new life. Ethan, Mr. Summer, the hardware man, came to install new locks and a modest security camera at the door. He was efficient and cheerful and put stickers on the windows that said "protected" in block letters. Mr. Weber helped me set up a power of attorney document, but not for a family member. We settled on a small, trusted professional, a local elder rights advocate, with instructions laid out in plain language, what powers, under what circumstances, with which checks and balances. It was a way to say I did not want to be alone in my later years, but I wanted the chosen aides to be accountable and external to the family dynamics that had almost swallowed me. I also sold the house. The act of selling was both practical and symbolic. For years, the house had been the stage on which much of my private life had been enacted. It had held memories and the marks of life, the paint peeled near the back door, the garden gnome Alfreda had brought me for my birthday, the small dent in the banister from a suitcase bounce. But the house had also been where a pattern of reliance had grown. I wanted a fresh start and decided to downsize, not to flee, but to simplify. The sale was quiet,
and the offer I accepted allowed me to set aside enough to replenish my savings and to create a small fund for travel and art classes and donations to elder protection groups. I remember the check she received from the sale and how it felt like a literal turning of the page. The money did not erase what had happened, neither did it feel like a trade for pain. It was a practical step that purchased autonomy. A smaller apartment with sun on the windowsill, a more accessible bathroom, a kitchen I could reach without climbing stairs. I bought a painting easel and canvases that smelled like possibility, and in the mornings I would make coffee and stand at the easel, watching colors begin to insist on shapes. There's a slow joy in learning the way light falls in the corner of a canvas. I learned to measure time not in how often someone asked me for help, but in how long I held a brush before deciding where the next stroke should go. I gave some money away too, not in a flourish, but in an intentional way. Small donations to local elder rights organizations and to a community charity that helps neighbors pay for emergency repairs. I wanted to create the kind of guardrails that Mr. Klein had once tried to imagine for future customers, little systems that could catch people before they fell into a pattern of exploitation. There were days when the memories rose sharply. I would pass the boutique where the dress had been bought and feel a flicker of the old hurt. Sometimes I would see a mother in the market handing cash to a child and feel a pang of old instinct, the desire to provide. But that instinct had changed. I learned to offer help that respected boundaries, to ask questions before answering, to consider whether my giving was meant to support and not to supply a lifestyle. Friends continued to surround me. Eleanor and the women from the Bridge Club visited regularly.
We cooked meals, watched old movies, and laughed in that particular way older women have about small humiliations, the kind that make you laugh because you have seen worse and survived. I painted small things at first, bowls of fruit, the corner of a room, and then, surprisingly, portraits. In those faces, I found a way to look outward and to practice trust without surrender. The legal experience left me with a cautious respect for structure. I did not become litigious or bitter. Courts, after all, are instruments. They can protect or misinterpret. My case had not been about punishment, but about recognition. The verdict had said, in that neutral voice of the law, that I remained capable of choosing my life. That was something I wanted to honor by living deliberately. The novelty of the travel fund led me to an impulsive decision, a trip to the coast with Cynthia and Diana. We rented a small cottage that had a view of the sea. I remember standing with my feet in the cold water and thinking about the way the waves come and go. Perhaps the most important lesson had been about tides, that some things withdraw and return, and that you can prepare and still enjoy the shore. On the second evening, we ate seafood and laughed so hard I forgot to count the minutes. I slept with the window open and dreamed of seascapes I would later try to capture on canvas. Sometimes, in quieter moments, I would sit before a blank page and write letters that I never sent. I would not write to accuse. I would write to explain. I wrote about the little things, the $800 dress coveting shame into something I could own, the $33,400 that had been a ledger and turned into a lesson. I wrote about what boundaries felt like, not walls, but gates you could open when trust had been earned and keep closed when you felt uncertain. I did not expect everything to fall neatly into place, but I wanted to be able to look back and say I had acted with intention. People asked me sometimes if I regretted the fight. It is not a question that allows a simple answer. I regretted the ways the family had been strained. I regretted that the relationship with my son had taken on this brittle texture, but I did not regret the moment I saw the number and decided to act. Some regrets are the correct kind. They are the ones that teach you how not to repeat a pattern. The community work I supported grew from my own experience. A simple idea I put money toward, an awareness pamphlet for neighbors and bank managers to spot patterns of elder exploitation, turned into a small series of workshops led by people who had done similar work. I sat in the back of a community center and listened to others talk, older men and women who had been taken advantage of by friends or family, a young banker who had changed the way his branch monitored transfers. The stories were sobering, but the room itself felt like a thread of warmth. We pooled knowledge the way one pools recipes, useful, communal, and a balm.
Sometimes at night, when the apartment was quiet and the city hummed faintly below, I would take the dress out and look at it. I kept it folded carefully in a drawer now, not as a relic of humiliation, but as a marker of a strange turning point. Clothes carry more than fabric, they carry memory. The dress would remain my private thing, folded and safe. On a mild afternoon, months after the trial, I walked to the park and sat in the sun with a sketchbook. A mother and a little girl passed by, and the child waved at me. I waved back. The moment was ordinary, and it felt like a small victory. Life goes on in ordinary acts of recognition. Someone I did not know appreciated my presence in the world, and that felt quietly vast. What did I learn? Perhaps what many of us learn in the long years, that boundaries are not the opposite of generosity, but its companion. That giving without limit can hollow the giver. That vigilance is not paranoia, it is self-respect. That documentation, simple things like bank statements and receipts and dates, can stand up in a room where memory is contested. And that community matters, that neighbors, friends, and small, reliable professionals are the kind of witnesses that keep a life intact. I do not pretend to have written the final chapter of my relationship with Max or Lena. People are complicated. There may come a day when closeness is possible again. There may not. What I did gain was the clarity to choose the terms of any future interactions. I would not be drawn into obligations because they felt expected, or because I had been socialized to believe my care equaled ownership. My care would be offered freely or not at all, and I would keep the right to accept or decline the position of provider as I saw fit. Once, when a neighbor asked me how I could remain so calm about money after all that had happened, I said, "Because dollar signs cannot define the shape of my worth." She nodded as if she understood. It was not a sentiment I would have been able to say in the beginning. It came from tests and courtrooms and mornings at the easel. It came from the slow reweaving of a life that had been pulled. My paintings now hang on the small walls of my apartment. I have a corner where I write letters and another where I keep the folder of records, neatly labeled records. I do not leave the folder open. It is not a talisman. It is a tool. I check in with Mr. Klein if something odd appears in my account. I have friends who call if they notice a change in my routine. I have the professional power of attorney who would act with my blessing and who sends an annual update. These are not dramatic protections. They are the scaffolding of ordinary life. Some afternoons I still think back to that phone call. "We already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." The phrase still carries its small surgical sting, but it no longer directs me. It is a memory, a moment that led me to count, to document, to choose.
It forced me from a posture of assumed compliance into a posture of self-determination. There is a curious grace in that. If you are listening and something about this story touches you, if you have ever felt the ache of being excluded or the quiet pressure of being expected to give until you are empty, I am not going to tell you what to do. I will say only what I did. I counted, I documented, I asked for professional evaluation, I gathered friends, I sought legal counsel, I opened a new account. I learned to say no in sentences that sounded like care. I love you, and I cannot give that right now. Those are not universal prescriptions. They are simply the acts that, for me, led to a life I could recognize as mine again. There is one last small thing worth saying. Dignity is not the same as vengeance. I did not pursue my son or his wife in the press. I did not seek to shame them publicly. I sought to be recognized and to keep my life intact. The courtroom's conclusion was not a trophy. It was a confirmation that autonomy matters. It allowed me to breathe more freely and to turn toward the things that nourish me. Paint, travel, the company of friends who stand with you when you need them. I asked when his wedding would be. She laughed and said, "We already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." That sentence opened something that hurt and then taught me to stand. I am not in the photograph of that day, but I have other images now, ones I have chosen. A painting of a bowl of oranges, a photograph of my feet in the sand on a coast I visited with friends, a snapshot of my small kitchen where sunlight always finds the counter in the morning. They are private and unpolished, and they are mine. If this story resonates with you, I would love to hear from you. Share a thought in the comments. What would you have done? Or what did you do in a moment like this? If you feel comfortable, tell us, so others might learn that they are not alone. Thank you for listening to mine.